Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. American and Russian diplomats are in the middle of high-stakes security meetings as tensions grow over Russia's troop presence on its shared border with Ukraine and deployment of forces to suppress anti-government protests in Kazakhstan. One major sticking point, the possibility of NATO expansion. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said in a briefing today it's up to Russia to de-escalate.
Russia and President Putin has built up a troop presence of 100,000 troops on the border of Ukraine. They have used bellicose rhetoric. It is up to them to determine if they are going to de-escalate. If there is a diplomatic path forward, that is a path forward that remains open.
On the domestic front, new polling from the Associated Press Nork Center for Public Affairs Research shows economic worries on the minds of many Americans. Over two-thirds of those surveyed say economic issues are their biggest concern right now. The economy bumped pandemic-related concerns from the top spot it held at the same time last year. Now, COVID-19 ranks as the number 2 issue of concern, with 37% naming it as one of their top priorities. The new polling data comes as President Biden's agenda is stalling on Capitol Hill as the end of the current congressional term rapidly approaches. Democrats are gearing up for a major voting rights push, while House Speaker Nancy Pelosi tells CBS News she has been in touch with Democratic Senator Joe Manchin about the president's social and climate spending plan.
In order to pass the Build Back Better, it's under reconciliation. We only need 51 votes. The bill that is the appropriations bill requires 60 votes in the Senate. So we have to do what is possible. I do think there's an agreement to be reached. It's so important for our country.
Meantime, a legal showdown between former President Trump and Democrats has escalated over January 6th. Mr. Trump's lawyers are now asking a judge to throw out a series of lawsuits from lawmakers and several Capitol Police officers. They accuse him of inciting the deadly riot and sparking unrest surrounding the election. This comes as Republican Congressman Jim Jordan refuses to cooperate with the January 6th committee. Meanwhile, COVID deaths are rising in cities hit early by Omicron, especially in New York and Boston. The variant is also spreading rapidly among children. Over the past week, the CDC says an average of 824 children per day were admitted into the hospital for the virus. Joining me now with more on all of this are Weijia Jiang, Courtney Subramanian, and Siobhan Hughes. Weijia is a CBS News senior White House correspondent. Courtney is White House correspondent for USA Today, and Siobhan covers Congress for the Wall Street Journal. Welcome to all of you. Weijia, let me start with you. We talked about this quite a bit last year. The president's top priority for his first year in office was getting his social and climate spending bill passed. Senator Joe Manchin said last month he could not support it. So where does that stand now?
Elaine, it's still standing where it was when we left it for the most part. Even though the White House insists that conversations continue, we just heard from the House Speaker right there who said she herself has talked to Senator Joe Manchin. There certainly has not been any movement forward. And clearly, the Senate Democrats have signaled that for now, they're shifting their focus. That's why there is this big push now on voting rights. And I think, that's something we're not talking enough about, that Build Back Better is just on the back burner now, given what a big piece of the president's agenda it is. But it's difficult to see what the path forward is at this point. Obviously, Pelosi is aware that Manchin has to come on board, and he is the reason why it stalled and continues to stall, because he believes it's too big. He doesn't agree with all of the elements in it. And so they're going to have to find a way to appease him and to make sure that Arizona's Kyrsten Sinema also will support whatever they come up with. But Elaine, again, we haven't heard much about any details coming out of these conversations happening behind the scenes with lower level staff. And certainly we know that the president and Senator Manchin have not had a direct conversation about moving forward in the past few weeks.
So, Siobhan, I'm curious, what are you hearing on that front? And also more broadly, the House and Senate are both back in session for the first time this year. So what is at the top of the agenda for Democrats and Republicans?
at the top of the agenda, certainly for the Senate right now, is that voting legislation that Democrats have been trying to pass for so long with so little success. Chuck Schumer indicating he's going to try again on that this week, and having that January 17th deadline of trying to change the Senate's filibuster rules if the Senate Democrats are unsuccessful. But right now, as we just said, almost no movement on that Build Back Better bill.
And Courtney, President Biden is heading to Georgia tomorrow to talk about voting rights. We've seen quite a bit of pushback from activists and others who say that they believe the administration hasn't done enough on this issue. So it's been an interesting sort of evolution to see now President Biden obviously making this a priority, and Weijia laid out sort of the political landscape that we're seeing this take place. But what is the strategy now for the White House?
White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki was asked about this today, and she tried to preview a little bit of what he plans to speak on tomorrow. Laying out a path forward of passing national voting rights legislation. He's expected to talk about changing the Senate filibuster rules, that 60-vote threshold that Republicans have used to block the package of voting rights legislation that's currently stalled in the Senate, but what those changes are still unclear. Democrats are unlikely to end the filibuster altogether because of Senator Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, the two senators we've talked a lot about this year, who both want to preserve the filibuster. But Democrats are considering a range of options. Biden has said he supports returning to a talking filibuster that would allow opponents of the bill to delay its passage as long as they can hold the floor, but eventually allow it to pass by a simple majority, or creating a carve-out that would exempt voting-related legislation from the filibuster. The problem with all of this is Biden doesn't have the votes to do any of this, let alone pass the legislation. He needs to convince Sinema and Manchin to get on board with whatever the Democratic strategy is to alter the filibuster. One thing I wanted to note was earlier today, Psaki was asked, whether she thought he had the political influence to force this sort of tipping point that Democrats are trying to push. And she said it was a hard question because we're talking about whether we can get enough votes in Congress to get this done. And I think that's the reality here. But again, it's an issue of timing. As Siobhan said, they have a January 17th deadline to force a vote on changing the filibuster if Republicans continue to block the measures. But as we know, the Democrats haven't done well with self-imposed deadlines on trying to get their priorities over the finish line.
Weijia, Courtney brings up an interesting point, this notion of political capital here. What else are you hearing from White House officials, maybe privately, on that point? Because, as you laid out, they're unable to get Build Back Better done. You've heard about the opposition with the filibuster. We know about that. But, at this particular point in the president's term, this was supposed to be the moment where there were, at least it was hoped by the administration, going to be some actual accomplishments to point to heading into the midterm election. So can you talk about what it is that White House officials are saying regarding the president's sort of political influence now at this point? And also tell us about this speech that the president is going to be having tomorrow. What's the significance of the planned location for it?
Well, this is going to happen in Atlanta, and of course, it has a largely historical significance, given its role, given its everything that unfolded there during the civil rights movement. But also, the White House views Georgia as ground zero for a lot of the election tampering, and a lot of the election, I should say, rules that Republicans have passed that they believe will limit people's right to vote. And so, we expect to hear a lot of that in the president's speech. Psaki also said today that he will lay out what's at stake. But she has been pressed about this, Elaine, many times in recent days. And what I'm hearing is a lot of symbolism, which is what the president has delivered before in these big speeches about voting rights. Voting rights advocates don't need to hear that anymore. What they want is a plan of action, and that is something that the president cannot provide. And that's something that we're hearing behind the scenes. Officials are frustrated because they're very aware of the reality of the situation, which, as Courtney pointed out, is that he doesn't have a vote. He doesn't have an actual say in the matter. And, you know, Manchin and Sinema have been pretty clear about how they intend to vote when it comes to eliminating the filibuster altogether. Even though Manchin has been open to smaller changes, at the end of the day, it's likely not going anywhere. So even if they support pieces of legislation that would change voting rights, the problem is they can't even get to that point because of the filibuster. And so even if the president were to come out and staunchly support a full carve-out or, you know, going to a talking filibuster, again, it's not up to him. It's up to these two senators. And I think that's where the sense of frustration comes, because he is doing what he can. He is having a lot of meetings. He is talking to a lot of civil rights groups. He is working with state and local leaders. But at the end of the day, Elaine, that's not enough to translate into action. So he can arm twist and he can have these difficult conversations with Senators Manchin and Sinema, but we have to be realistic here. And regardless of how big and colorful and symbolic the speech is tomorrow, that doesn't mean it will make a difference when it comes to the votes that matter.
Yeah, so Siobhan, let's dig in a little bit. If that's the case, as we just laid it out, politically speaking, the reality looks very tough for voting rights legislation, then what should we expect to see here come January 17th, which is MLK Day, Martin Luther King Jr. Day?
Well, right now, it looks like a whole lot of nothing. And what you're seeing within the Democratic conference or Democratic caucus is a lot of simmering tension underneath the surface. So you saw that break out in full in December when fingers were pointed directly at Joe Manchin. And then you saw Democrats kind of try to step back from the brink and regroup. But those tensions are there. And it wouldn't surprise me to see a lot of that spill into the open more fully as the voting agenda falls apart. I thought it was instructive that the person who said she was having conversations with Joe Manchin on Build Back Better was Nancy Pelosi. He's got a history with her, and maybe it's time for somebody else to step in and do some negotiating. I'd also like to add one point, building on some of what Weijia reported on, which is that there is a sense on the part of some Senate Democrats that the presidency itself has been diminished in the course of these negotiations, that for all the time President Biden spent with Joe Manchin, it came about empty-handed, really.
Yeah, so Siobhan, let me ask you a little bit more about that, because, you know, I do remember a number of readouts from colleagues about these conversations between Senator Manchin and President Biden being, quote unquote, productive. But as you point out, when it comes to actual results, we've seen very little of that. Can you talk about that a bit more, this concern that there's been a diminishment, you think, or Senate Democrats think, and have told you, in their eyes at least, when it comes to the Biden presidency because of that?
Well, the concept is that the president is the one figure in any party who has a national profile, a national platform. And so he or she, if that cuts to that point, is the sole figure who can push the ball forward in a unique way. And that didn't happen with President Biden. And it's unclear why. But if you look at essentially who's running the country right now, the person in charge would appear to be Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, because it is his vote, his voice that is predominant.
Yeah, it was interesting because I remember that Vice President Harris was actually asked that from you know, whether or not it was that Joe Manchin who was in charge or President Biden. She very forcefully pushed back against that notion and said it was Joe Biden who was in charge. Courtney, let's shift to international matters. The U.S. and Russia are holding security talks in Geneva. What do we know about how those high-stakes talks are going?
Yeah, the talks today lasted nearly 8 hours, but both sides really dug in, and that's what was expected. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman held a briefing call with reporters following the session and largely echoed what we heard from the Russian side, which is that there was no progress really made. And that's because of a major sticking point that you mentioned at the top, which is that Russia is demanding that Ukraine be permanently barred from joining NATO. And Sherman has called that a non-starter. She said the U.S. refused to slam close NATO's open door policy, and the U.S. wouldn't make any decisions about Ukraine without Ukraine, Europe and NATO allies. She also said that the answer is still not clear about whether they're prepared to de-escalate. That if they are, as they said they were, they can prove it by returning their troops to their barracks. So there's still a few more meetings this week. She'll brief NATO and European Union allies tomorrow before the NATO-Russia Council meeting that's scheduled for Wednesday. And she'll also Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe in Vienna on Thursday. But one thing is that she did indicate was that there is a few areas for potential compromise, chief among them reviving a treaty with Russia that regulates the deployment of intermediate nuclear missiles in Europe, as well as looking at reciprocal limits on limits and transparency on military exercises. So while both sides have really dug in and we don't expect much progress this week, it is a chance to sort of recalibrate the US-NATO Russia relationship and sort of open dialogue, reopen dialogue for between US and Russia after what has been a lot of tension in recent months.
Extremely tense. Weijia, a COVID response, especially on testing and school closures, are reemerging as pressing issues. How is the White House trying to address this?
Well, the White House continues to make its case for why and how it has ramped up testing in recent weeks. They are launching a website that will allow Americans to sign up for a free test that will be shipped to their homes. Just today, the White House press secretary talked about the efforts to ramp up manufacturing after the U.S. sealed some deals for the supplies to be secured in order to get to that point of meeting demand. And they've talked at length about the various clinics that they've helped to set up around the country. The problem, Elaine, is that these things take time to unfold. And right now we are in the middle of this Omicron surge. And the fact on the ground is that people still can't get their hands on a test, especially when it comes to at-home tests that we know can be very helpful and critical in tracking the disease, the virus, and preventing spread. And so that's why I think there has been so much criticism, why there continues to be so many questions about what more can be done. Of course, testing is a huge component of keeping schools open as well. These two things go hand in hand, and we're seeing what happens play out in Chicago, the third largest school district in the country, when you don't have the tests. Teachers there continue to say they do not have the resources to stay open safely, which is why the classrooms are not open right now. So I think the White House is really struggling to talk about what they plan to do because, President Biden has such a long-standing and close relationship with labor unions of all kinds. Now you have teachers who are pushing back, saying they're not ready to do exactly what he is urging them to do, which is stay open in the classroom. And so the White House says that they're continuing to work with local leaders and school officials, but we have yet to hear directly from the president something forceful to the Chicago school system to say, hey, you got to get back into the classroom that explicitly, because again, it's a very delicate line that they are trying to walk. But, I think the White House would argue they're doing whatever they can. It's just, not happening fast enough.
Well, Siobhan, Republican Congressman Jim Jordan says he will not cooperate with the House January 6th committee. How does the panel move forward with Jordan and other Republican lawmakers?
Well, this is going to be something that the panel has to figure out. I talked today to a former House General Counsel, Irv Nathan, and he said, absolutely, this committee, Congress, does have the right to issue the subpoena. But the rub comes in the enforcement. If you go to a court, you can't do that because sitting lawmakers are protected by the speech and debate clause. And in fact, that's something that Jim Jordan nodded to in his letter to the committee when he said he was not going to participate. Not only did he say, I've got nothing to add in terms of your legislative purpose, I've got nothing to add in terms of security, he says, everything else you were asking me about had to do with my official duties. So it's not that the committee couldn't issue the subpoena. The question is, how are they going to enforce it? And it would have to be a mechanism, perhaps like stripping him of a committee assignment, which is weak tea compared to what we've seen the committee do with figures like Steve Bannon, holding him in contempt, and then the Justice Department following on with an indictment. So it's a very tricky situation for this committee right now.
Courtney, Republican Senators John Thune and Ron Johnson announced they will run for re-election. What does that mean for Republicans heading into midterms?
Well, John Thune is a very... You go on.
Sorry. Their decisions, sort of fill out the pieces for the Republican strategy to try to win back control of the Senate, where, the GOP really needs to net one seat to return Mitch McConnell to majority leader. Democrats are defending 14 Senate seats, and compared to the GOP, which is defending 20. For Johnson, Wisconsin is a key battleground state in the midterm election, but he is also a fierce defender of Donald Trump, and that could be good news for Democrats who are running a fairly crowded primary, but his loyalty to Trump makes it easier from a messaging standpoint for Democrats who have really, cast themselves as the antidote to Trump, and this sort of fits with their playbook that they've used so far. And for Thune, in South Dakota, him seeking a fourth term is important for a couple of reasons. He, of course, is in a reliably red state. But also he's been on the receiving end of Trump's ire, and that has caused some Republicans to leave Congress in the past. So the fact that he's moving ahead with this is important, also because he's a candidate for Republican leader whenever McConnell decides to step aside. So this certainly brings some answers to some questions about what the Republican strategy is heading into the midterms.
All right, well, speaking of being on the receiving end of ire from former President Trump, Weijia, over the weekend, Republican Senator Mike Rounds said this about former President Trump's baseless claims of election fraud.
We looked, as a part of our due diligence, we looked at over 60 different accusations made in multiple states. While there were some irregularities, there were none of the irregularities which would have risen to the point where they would have changed the vote outcome in a single state. The election was fair as we've seen. We simply did not win the election as Republicans for the presidency.
So, Weijia, has the former president given any indication of letting go of the false assertion of widespread election fraud? And how is that issue shaping up for the midterms and beyond?
No, Elaine, I think the exact opposite is true. And we saw that on January 6th when the former president issued a series of statements really repeating what he has always said since last election day, which is, as we just heard, simply false, not true. And so he has sent out, statement after statement, talking about basically how he was robbed, how he should be here at the White House, et cetera. And so I think that this, will affect the races coming up in two different ways on the practical side. I think, what has unfolded in the past year for this country has eroded the trust of the voting systems and what happens when you go to the ballot for some people, and we don't know how that will play out, how it could impact the physical vote, and what could happen afterward if some of the races do not turn out the way that some people expected them to. And then there's the philosophical problem here, Elaine, about, what the former president is spewing and how many of those in his base and in the Republican Party continue to buy it. And if you look at recent polls, including CBS, there's still a significant number of Republicans who believe that the outcome wasn't fair and correct. And so I think that this is a real problem. This is what Democrats, what President Biden, what the White House is sounding the alarm about. And I think one question that we all have to wait to see is how much influence Trump actually still has. How much stumping he plans to do. Is he going to be out on the road for these candidates? And what happens in those states where he does endorse candidates? I think that will be really telling about how much political influence he still has. So it will be an important topic. This will impact the race on many, many fronts.
Certainly will, and we're going to continue to follow how those baseless claims are amplified and what effect, how it is that they are manifested, not just with elected officials or former officials, but also just among everyday American citizens, how that may or may not take root. All right, Weijia Jiang, Courtney Subramanian, and Siobhan Hughes, thank you all very much.